You're listening to NAPAbroadcasting.com.
Thanks for joining us here at Napa Broadcasting. I'm Jeff Schechtman. I think we can all stipulate that Napa needs a new city hall. A world-class city deserves better than it has now. In addition, government offices scattered all over downtown is also not the most efficient way to run a city, even one the size of Napa. But does that mean that the alternative is to build a Taj Mahal? To build Napa's biggest public project at $152 million and rising, and have it built by officials that have never taken on a project of that size, one that has only gotten minimal public input, and a city council that has not really explored all of the alternatives. A few weeks ago here on Napa Broadcasting, you heard Mike Parness make the case for doing just this. Now Parness is gone. Police Chief Steve Potter is stepping in to take over management of the city, and this change could be the perfect opportunity to really reassess where we are on this project and figure out what's next. Sure, it'll be an issue in the upcoming council election, but if you think the city is clueless as to how to do a project of this size, most of the ragtag would-be council candidates are even more clueless. So where do we begin? Napa community member John Salmon thinks he at least knows the right questions to ask. He's been asking them lately, but so far to no avail. Now, with the change in city management, maybe that will also change. We're going to talk about that today as John joins us here in the studio. John Salmon, thanks so much for coming in.
Good afternoon, Jeff.
It's great to have you here. Thanks so much for spending some time with us to talk about this. You've been talking about this for a while, but before we get into the merits of this project and the way it's evolved, I want to talk a little bit about your background and really your interest in this, but really how it dovetails with some of the things that you have spent years and years and years of your life doing.
Not that many years.
One less years.
Thanks for having me on. I started out in Chicago as an accountant and attorney, and was fortunate in the mid-'80s to move to San Francisco to manage a very large real estate company's property sale and development operations. That company is now called Catellis Development. At the time it was Santa Fe Pacific Realty. And it owned 3 million acres of land in 38 states, or a land area about 3 times the size of Rhode Island. So I had a great deal of experience working on real estate all over the country. After that, I was fortunate to be asked by Pete Wilson to go up to the governor's office here in Sacramento and try to bring new real estate policies, private real estate policies, to state government. So in that job for 5 years, I worked on over 6 million square feet of state office building consolidations. Put that in perspective, here in Napa, the building being discussed is about 120,000 feet or so. So it's a small microcosm of the work I did in Sacramento. And also dealt with public land owned by the state, which I'm sorry to report, but happy to report that we fixed it, that in 1990, the state of California did not have an inventory of its real estate. There were 39 departments of state government that owned or leased property. And if I wanted to know what was happening in San Francisco, I needed to make 39 phone calls and hope that the leaders of those 39 agencies would actually disclose what they owned. So one of the first things we did, and just it dovetails with this, is put together basically because in the early 90s we had the computing power to do it, a graphic representation of all the state-owned properties in San Diego, Los Angeles, Sacramento, San Francisco. And in doing that, we found out that the state of California owned 8 city blocks next to San Francisco City Hall, but they were leasing over 1 million square feet of office space in 40 locations around the city. So as a facility manager, and I'm sure you've got many in your audience that have managed corporate facilities, that's not a very good way to run a business. And so I went into Governor Wilson and I said, Governor, are we planning on moving our San Francisco offices to Iowa anytime soon? And of course he looked at me with a very puzzled look and he said, well, no, John, we're not. And I said, well, that's the only reason, like business reason, that I can think of why we would be in 40 leased offices in San Francisco in over 1 million square feet, and the longest lease was only 3 years. in the most expensive office market at the time in the country. So that set off a process to build a 1 million square foot building in San Francisco. It's actually the California Supreme Court building, immediately adjacent to and to the right of City Hall when you're standing in Civic Center Plaza. That building was also done design build, actually the first design build project done by the state of California, and actually done with a bill that was sponsored by Willie Brown when he was in the legislature. And with Willie, I put together a model of San Francisco City Hall, the Civic Center, which actually showed that a design that Daniel Burnham had done in the early 1900s. Daniel Burnham, who also was famous for Grant Park in Chicago and many other civic centers. And San Francisco Civic Center actually started at the Van Ness and went all the way over to Mission Street, a little bit like a hockey stick. And so today, when you're in that area, look, as a result of my pulling out that plan, the federal government actually put the federal building over on Mission Street. So now a plan that was started in probably 1904 is not quite finished yet, but it's a plan that's still being used. So with that kind of history, we can talk more specifically about Napa. What Napa is doing really is designing its future city for 100 years.
Mm-hmm. Is it your experience that when you look at governments, whether it's city government, state government, whatever, getting involved in these real estate projects, that the problems, that the obstacles, that the way it's approached is often the same? Are there the same traps that get set every time?
There are, and I think the one thing I tried to do when I was in the governor's office is bring the best real estate companies to government. I mean, one of the problems that government has is it's not a good customer. Private sector doesn't like working with government, at least the best elements of the private sector, because it's done by committee, nobody's in charge, things get changed all the time, projects stop and start, and it's just very difficult to work with them, and usually not very profitable. So when we did those 6 million square feet of buildings when I was with the governor, I actually made an extra effort to go to the private sector and bring in companies that weren't normally working with government. The San Francisco building was designed by Skidmore, Owens & Merrill. Never before had they done a California state building. In fact, the state architect who did all the state buildings before that had a design criteria, which I used to describe, that the design criteria for the state architect was that it doesn't matter what the building costs, as long as it looked cheap. That was the and that phrase became rather famous in the legislature, and got us away from the state architect designing buildings. The developer of that building was Heinz Interest, who's done office buildings around the world.
Yeah.
And the reason they got involved was not because it was a state building or a 1 million square foot building, but because of the people that were presented to them who would carry the project forward. So it can be done, but it's really, really difficult. And I want to very quickly add that the city has hired a company by the name of Plenary Group, who is fabulous, but they dedicate themselves to public buildings. So I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that the private sector real estate people who are in the private sector stay with the private sector, but there is a cadre now of real estate companies that gear themselves to the public sector and actually organize to serve that business. Doesn't mean they do a bad job, just means they're set up for the fits and the starts.
Given that they are set up for the fits and the starts, why should we worry so much? If they brought in a company that you think is a good company, that has experience dealing with the craziness of government, the ups and downs, the committee, etc., why should we be worried about the degree to which the city council and the city manager have a grip on this?
I think that's fundamentally one of the problems here in Napa. The city council, I believe, has a false sense of security, that Plenary is giving them their best advice on what need be done for the Civic Center and the Superblock. And actually what Plenary is a real estate consultant who, with respect to the Superblock, is using their expertise to develop a private development. But with respect to City Hall, is simply following the instructions of city staff. And so to the extent that city staff provides them bad instruction or bad direction. The city council doesn't know that. They believe that they're getting the best advice from plenary. A perfect example of that is in the original plans that came out for the building last fall, because I disagree with this as a strategy. One of the strategies of the new city hall is that the police headquarters and city hall will be in the same building. Police headquarters around the state are subject to what's called the Essential Services Act, which means the building requires additional security, additional protection, additional seismic work, and basically becomes a fortress that will allow government to continue forever. City Hall does not have that same requirement, but by putting the police headquarters in the same building as the city administration, the entire building becomes an essential services building and causes additional costs that wouldn't otherwise be caused. Most communities solve this problem by having the development of police headquarters and city hall, if they're adjacent, be horizontally built. So that city hall is in one building, there might be a small central lobby to both buildings, and then horizontally on a larger piece of property, the police headquarters would be adjacent. So the vertical integration is really a problem. Just one example of that is that one of the essential services requirements is that all police emergency vehicles have to be in secure parking. So in the first designs for the building, for the proposed city hall building. City hall. This is going back to last fall. The parking for 28 SWAT vehicles, police emergency vehicles, was put on the first floor of the building, inside the building. Now, the square foot cost of the building was probably going to approach $800 to $900 square foot, which means based on the size of a normal parking space, each one of those parking spaces would cost $374,000. All right, a parking space in a parking lot outside in a screened area costs about $10,000. So I pointed that out in one of the meetings last fall, and they actually changed the plan to move the parking out into Washington Street, which they're going to close. But now by doing that, by putting secured parking on one side of the building, all ground level access to the building is cut off because you can't get through the screened in parking area. So the building is only accessible on three sides.
I want to talk more about the Superblock and explain to our listeners what it is. But first of all, when you were doing this for the state and the governor's office, it was your job. You were getting compensated for it. Not the case in this instance. Talk a little bit about what you've been involved clearly in community activity before. You were very involved in the effort to revitalize Copia. But what brought you to this project? Why have you gotten so involved with it?
Well, I moved to Napa in 1998 after a career in real estate development. And I decided that I love Napa, so I would have two roles for myself. First is I would never develop anything for myself in Napa, and secondly, I would never have another employee. And both have served me well. I probably have a lot of people that don't like me in Contra Costa County for developments I've done there, and folks in Sonoma County that don't like me there. But what the benefit of that is that folks in town that know me know that I have experience in real estate development and urban planning, but I don't have an oar in the Napa water, if you will. Other than my home, I have no other economic interest, and so it does two things. One, it gives what I say a little bit more credibility for people who know my history, but I think more important, it allows me to speak up. I wrote a letter to the editor of the Register a few weeks ago, and I couldn't believe the number of comments that I got from people that I know who thanked me for writing that letter, not just for what I said, but because they were fearful of saying something for fear that there might be some retribution because they were trying to process a building permit, or that saying anything bad about city staff might cause them some economic harm in something they were doing in town. So I guess that's why I'm involved, because I understand it, and I'm not afraid to.
You mentioned the Superblock before. A lot of our listeners may not know what that is. Explain what you refer to and what Mike Parness, when he was here, referred to as the Superblock.
one of the premises on which this project was started, I think, by the city manager, was that he wanted to set it up in a way that he could say that it wasn't going to cost the taxpayers of Napa anything. All right, and so fundamentally, the project was started not on we need a city hall and a police headquarters, but we need to find a way to pay for a city hall and a police headquarters. And so one of the ways to do that is to sell public land. Another way to do it is to sell that public land for hotel development, which generates a transit occupancy tax of some magnitude. So kind of in a backwards way, the Superblock is the funding for the new Civic Center. Doesn't pay for all of it, although over time it certainly will help. But what it does is it puts the city in a position of competing with the private sector on other hotel development. It gets the developer of that Superblock in a very tricky legal situation, because there are many people, including me, who believe that the development by the private sector on a piece of land purchased from the public sector to fund a public project, i.e. City Hall, places the Superblock development under the prevailing wage laws of the state, which is a liability that actually falls back on the city. So somebody could come back years from now and sue the city.
Yeah, that seems to be an unclear issue.
No,
I mean, if you ask lawyers about it, I mean, to your point, it could go on for years as a legal battle.
Exactly, but it could be a very large number. I mean, it could be a very, very large number, especially when hotels are involved. When most of our hotels here in Napa are not union operated, they're non-union. So. In any event, the development of the Superblock of a hotel, housing, retail, which we don't need because we've got more retail than we'll ever need, which is probably the subject for a whole nother radio
program,
show.
Right.
And just on the side, I started my career building warehouse buildings around O'Hare Airport in Chicago and watched as just-in-time manufacturing came to life. And warehouses which were needed because manufacturers were bad at ordering raw material and bad at scheduling production for finished goods, needed the warehouses to put the stuff. All of a sudden they got really good at scheduling materials and didn't need warehouses, which was the beginning of the R&D phase of buildings. We have no alternative uses for a lot of this retail buildings.
When we talk about the Superblock and all the problems that are inherent with that, and you touched on some of them, and certainly there are a few more, talk about what you understand to be the reasons this came to be the direction that the city seemed to want to go in.
Well, there was an RFQ process to the credit of the city. I mean, they went through a process. Nobody really watched it, I don't think, very closely because it's about a lot of mumbo jumbo for the guy in the street. There were three proposers. One dropped out, leaving plenary with the current proposal, and one other proposal by a company that had identified a property on Soskell, which was vacant and could be used for the building of a new city hall. And for reasons probably that was out of downtown, it was kind of in an awkward place. The city council went with the solution of building in the downtown area. And that project came in with this joint Superblock to fund the city hall. So I think if you just go back to May of 2017, when that decision was made, I suspect that it was, and I don't want to say this in a bad way, but a lack of experience that didn't see the pitfalls in that. I did speak at that city hall meeting. I think I cautioned about the double moves that would be created because the only way to connect the financing with the new construction is to vacate all of the city offices within the Superblock, which includes police headquarters and fire station, and all of the community development block, and go somewhere else for what the city says is going to be 2 years, which
we know will be 3. I mean,
it could be 4. I mean, given what happened with the Archer and an earthquake and rain, and I mean, construction Glazer. I mean, the Archer was delayed because of the Salesforce Tower in San Francisco had occupied every glazer who put windows in a building They couldn't get glaziers to come and put windows in the Archer Hotel. So, I mean, things can happen during construction. Worse, they'll scatter these city offices all over downtown or outside of downtown, and people will just go nuts trying to find where they pay a bill or, get a water leak
There's
fixed.
also a tremendous amount of cost in relocating again.
Right, absolutely. And it's not just in physical costs of moving and renting space, et cetera, but it's really disruptive costs. I mean, just the function of government really will get disturbed. So, I think the other thing that does too, which bothers me quite a bit, the project currently is being talked about as a $120 million project. I know how government budgets, and I know how they can stuff things into different projects. So all of those costs that are going to be expended for interim space are probably going to go on a different budget, and so we'll really never know exactly how much this project would cost if it proceeds the way it is.
Which raises the question of what the alternatives are, and why the council and the city manager and even the original RFQ didn't look at other alternatives and other ways to approach this.
Well, in an RFQ process, you're pretty much confined to what is brought to you, all right? So the process is driven by the proposers, basically. I think what could have happened and probably should have happened before they went out with the RFQ is the city should have decided where it wanted City Hall and should have decided where it wanted police headquarters. And that's a process that I tried to bring up now probably 3 or 4 years ago. I put together a map of downtown Napa and showed anybody that was willing to look at it how much city and county and sanitation district property was actually owned within a very small area from Jefferson Street over to Saskell, and from maybe the Napa River Inn up north on Main Street.
We'll put a link in here to that. People can take a look at that.
I will be happy to post it, and I think when people look at it, they should realize some of the properties like Veterans Park probably will always have to be Veterans Park, but a bad garage on 2nd Street doesn't need to be a bad garage on 2nd Street forever. I mean, it could be torn down and something else put up there. The Sullivan block sits empty next to the county building. The county's moved most of their people out to Day Labs. I don't know that they even need the county administration building anymore. Maybe that could be a city hall. So I think had the city and the county sat down together and gone through all its property ownership and said, okay, where should City Hall be? And gone to a piece of property that wasn't currently occupied, all right? So the construction could take place. When construction was finished, there would be one move of the city administrative space to the new building. And I think that the police department doesn't need to be downtown. We have some maintenance yards here in town that could very well be consolidated, and the police, I think, probably would be better situated in a place like Saskell and Lincoln, where there is currently a city corporation yard, far bigger than what's necessary there, and there could be some housing built next to it. Those are questions that could have been asked that weren't, I don't believe, asked, and maybe they still can be asked. I mean, we're not, the buildings aren't built yet, so there's always a chance.
Talk a little bit about what the Sullivan Block is. People know it as really the parking lot next to the county administration building.
It is the parking lot immediately west of the county administration building and before the church, which we all love so dearly.
Which has been an issue. I mean, the county was looking at that to build something at one point. I can't even remember what, but I do remember that blocking the church became this huge issue.
No, there's no question about that. It did, and it would have to be dealt with. There's in the design of any building that's built on that block, that's one of the things you have to deal with. I think I have probably 3 different alternatives that are better than what we're doing. And I'm kind of Max Nix, as use an old expression. Either one, anyone is fine and better than what we're doing now. But we won't get there unless we talk about it.
Talk a little bit about city-county cooperation in this, why you think it's so necessary, and why it hasn't happened.
Well, there's 2 things. Well, one is the counties, after they bought Day Labs, took care of their facility needs for quite a while. They need to deal with the Carruthers building, which they should probably just get out of and sell. I understand there's some certificates of participation on that. There are ways to defease those. I mean, there are ways to deal with the financing. But what the county really needs right now is money. They need money to build a new jail, which they absolutely have to build, and in which they're on a path to build. And they will build as much as they can with whatever money they have. So if they've got more money, they could build it all, which is certainly less expensive than building it in 8 stages or whatever the money raising is. The city, on the other hand, needs a new police headquarters. No question that our police facilities are totally inadequate. We don't satisfy seismic requirements in the existing building. We don't have the kind of evidence storage that needs to take place. I mean, I've been interested to find out that our local police department needs to store evidence for 99 years. I mean, it's just ridiculous storage requirements. And I'd love to have a new city hall. I mean, we could probably get by with the one we have, but it'd be nice to have a new one. It is inefficient the way the officers are scattered around the area. So I guess I went on there and I lost the question.
Well, I mean, the question really was city-county cooperation, and why has there not been more of an effort to at least talk about potential efforts?
I thought with the 3 younger members of the county board and with the composition of the city council, this would be a great time for those kinds of conversations to occur. I talk with both city council members and county board members individually, and all of them say they'd love to talk with their counterparts. So I don't know who to believe anymore.
Mm-hmm. Where do you think the problem has been?
Well, I think historically there were the typical governmental problems. The government, I mean, nobody in the county government or in the city government looks at you and I and say that we're both their customer, we're both their owner. As a taxpayer, we pay both the county and the city, and we'd like to see them operate as a single entity. They just don't. I mean, you go to the state government, there are 39 agencies of state government that don't act.
But the one thing that's different here, and, not to be lost, that of the 5 members of the Board of Supervisors, 4 of them represent parts of the city of Napa.
It's true. This is true. I mean, but I don't think... it's kind of who's going to raise their hand first, and nobody has really been willing to raise their hand. The staff will not do it. I mean, this has got to come from the elected officials. I could not have done any of the things I did in Sacramento for Governor Wilson without the business card with a gold seal on it that said I was from the governor's office. I mean, it's just the way government works.
Uh-huh. Talk a little bit about how far along the city is in this process and what it would take right now, even if the city wanted to slow it down or pause it or stop it.
Well, I don't have the internal numbers, so I can only guess at where they are. I suspect that they've probably spent somewhere around $1 million to $1.5 million in staff time and outside consultants to get where they are. In addition, were they to stop the contract with the plenary group, there is a breakup fee in that probably will cost them another $1 million or thereabouts. I think that cost can be avoided because I think the plenary group should stay as a consultant to the city. They've done absolutely nothing wrong and have all the information and all the relationships to be able to continue on whatever project the city chooses to do. With respect to the $1.5 million that's already been spent, some portion of that, impossible for me to identify, was spent to identify the organizational needs of each of the city departments, how many square feet a secretary should have, how many conference rooms they need, and all the programming elements of planning a building. And that information is useful to the architect, whether it's put in the current building or moved into another box, basically.
Right.
So some portion of that $1.5 million or $2 million, maybe, I don't know how much they've actually spent, is clearly reusable, if you will, and helpful.
What would it take in terms of political will at this point to slow this down, to at least pause it right now? What would have to happen? I've
never run for office and never planned to, so I don't know how to measure will. I know that I've had no difficulty speaking up and being open that if I'm wrong, happy to be told that I'm wrong and have somebody help to explain to me why I'm wrong. To the extent that I have written letters to the city council and the city staff at every point at every city council meeting that's taken place on City Hall going back to May of 2017, what the reaction for me has been is like the parking spaces, they work around the edges. All right. I have pointed out that the strategy is wrong, that the fundamental approach to building this project is wrong, and nobody seems yet willing to take that step. I think that a fresh look might help. I think that I've got great respect for Steve Potter. I have great respect for Mike Parnas. I mean, he's done a good job for the city. I feel awful with the health issues he's had,
Right.
and wish him very well as he goes forward into retirement. But this was Mike's project. There's no question that he was totally in charge of it and was driving it. And Steve Potter's got a lot of new things to work on. I mean, he knows the police department, but he's got a lot of city government to learn about. And so I think one of the things the council could do, rather than having the will to do anything, is have the will to give Steve Potter a chance. Have the will to give Steve Potter a chance to get into the manager's seat and gain the reins of city government unfettered with a really complicated and complex project. And just pausing it for that reason alone would be, I think, really beneficial.
You've been at all those meetings you mentioned where this has been discussed. How public a process has this been, and how does it compare to other similar kinds of projects in your personal experience with respect to public input?
Well, that's a good one. On the development side, the developer and me, since I tried to do a very large gaming project in Richmond, there used to be 3 people in favor of the project and 300 against it. So, it's in fact, I even had one night where a woman got up to the microphone at public comment and complained that our project was going to bring crime to Richmond, which I will never forget, at a time when Richmond had more murders than Chicago. The reaction, there really hasn't been any up until maybe the last 3 or 4 months. There was nobody that would come to these meetings for this purpose. There'd be people in the room because there was some other thing going on at the council. But it's complicated. It's kind of inside baseball. It's not and there wasn't enough information. It wasn't until November of last year that any concept drawings even came out. And I remember at that meeting, all the questions were about the roof overhang, whether the roof overhung the street, more than it should, and whether it would block the sun. So it had nothing to do with $120 million being spent by the city or any of the other issues that were involved.
If the city were to build on the Sullivan Block or use some of the county administrative building or any one of these other ideas, what would you conceive happening to the existing Superblock?
I think all of the city-owned land that's not necessary for a police headquarters or a city hall or a city park, all right, should be zoned for housing at whatever density the city council chooses to put on it. And I would start with this downtown specific plan. If you can do 5-story of apartment, great, do it. And so you could have everything from 30 or 35 units to the acre, and then on the edges maybe go down to 10 units to the acre, 15, whatever, and then sell it. Give it to the private sector. One of the things I've learned just in the last few weeks is that all of downtown Napa has been designated an opportunity zone under the new Federal Tax Act, which is an opportunity for people with appreciated stock or real estate to defer capital gains on property that they wish to sell today if they reinvest the proceeds of that sale in an opportunity zone. So we could have a lot of new housing built by people right here in Napa who are reluctant to sell property because they don't want to pay the capital gains tax. They could actually either defer it or eliminate it entirely.
What about the idea of using that property in part for a hotel, again, as a way to defray some of the cost of a new city hall, wherever it might be?
That the TOT, and I said this to Mike Parnas, he's designating the TOT from the hotel in the Superblock for the Civic Center, but any TOT on any hotel anywhere in the city of Napa could be designated for City Hall. So I mean, that's just it's a red herring argument, basically. Mm-hmm. It's a term I haven't used for a long time. I don't even, do we even still do red herrings on prospectuses?
I think so.
Okay,
yeah.
Good.
What about the cost of it? Because even moving it again to the Sullivan Block or somewhere else, if a new building is going to be built, some of the same issues arise. You have a big project, certainly bigger than any other project that the city has handled, arguably, and you have people that have not had that experience before, and all the construction issues that you've touched upon, the potential for it going way over budget, and all those problems that you've mentioned are all still there, even if it's built somewhere else.
What we did with the state, which worked out really well, was first make that decision about where the building should go. Second thing we did was we gave the development community all the requirements. Here are the 12 departments that go in the building. Here's how many square feet they need. Here's how much conference space or public meeting space we need. And then we went out to the the private sector, and said, okay, there's the land, there's the requirement. Tell us what it would cost to build it and what it would look like. So we got 3 apples to compare. Apple, apple, apple. And if the private sector was brought into it knowing that whoever was selected would actually get to build the building, we could get a Heinz Interest. We could get a Skidmore, Owens & Merrill. We could get the best of the best to come to Napa, because as much as we here in Napa sometimes forget, we think we're just a quiet little town in Northern California, the rest of the world thinks we're pretty important. And so that includes the real estate community.
Of course, there's no question that this will become some kind of an issue, as I mentioned in the introduction, in the upcoming city council campaign. That's a two-edged sword, because there also could be an awful lot of misinformation and a lot of rhetoric that doesn't help solve the problem.
I think that's true, but I guess that the thing that I've landed on in the election season is that people that are running for office are happiest if they don't have to answer. So if they can say, well, why don't we just let Steve Potter get in his chair and figure it out, may be the best answer. And I think perhaps involving, we've got a lot of people here in Napa, and I happen to have a pretty good background in real estate. There are a lot of other people that do too, who've run large corporate real estate programs, who've been CEOs of corporations with facilities all around the world. And these are not unique issues. I mean, they're all the same. I mean, it involves government, so maybe you've got some restrictions and requirements that are a little different than the private sector. But basically, you got to find where you want to build it. You got to figure out what to build. You got to build it, and you got to pay for it. I mean, those things just don't change.
Right. How long are you going to stay with this? What are you going to do next in terms of continuing to try and get people to focus on this?
I am going to do everything I can to get the city council to give Steve Potter a chance to get his arms around what his job is, which is running the city, and then offer up. I think what I'd like to see happen, whether we can get it to happen or not, I would like to see if the city and the county would set up a 2x2, which is not a public activity. It's not a Brown Act activity, and invite a handful of private sector people to join them, to sit down and have a conversation about all the public land ownership in downtown Napa and what we want to do. What are some of the best alternatives, and bring plenary into that, because plenary has a lot of information, and then come out of that meeting to the public and say, look, we've got all this property. We think it'd be a good idea to put City Hall here, whether we can pay for it today or tomorrow or whenever, but this is where it should go. Here's some property that the county can trade with the city. And the county can sell it after the city owns it. But put a strategy together that we understand the strategy, not just what the building is going to look like or what the roof overhang is. So it's really a function of some elected, some private sector, and conversation.
We'll link a few documents to this. Talk a little bit about what people should take a look at. You mentioned the map that shows all the property that the city and county own. We'll put that up.
We can post some aerial photography that shows city-county ownership, that shows corporation yards owned by the city, the county, Caltrans, the school district. I mean, if you look at some of these aerials, the land is half empty in areas that could be for housing. We could also put up a little information on these opportunity zones. I think that's a Federal Tax Act provision that very few people are focused on yet. It's really new. It's only been around for a few months. And the designation just took place a couple of months ago. And, I guess whatever, if you get questions, I'm happy to try to reply or put other things up on your website to help.
Terrific. John Salmon, I thank you so much for coming in and shedding some light on all this, and I have a feeling we're going to be talking about this some more.
I hope so. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to NAPAbroadcasting.com. Napa Valley Radio for the way we live now.